your body is actually primed to go into ketosis in late pregnancy. You're like, when you're pregnant, you're like threefold more likely to be in ketosis after an overnight fast than when you're not pregnant. Your body just like very rapidly switches from fat burning to carb burning at will. Even between meals, sometimes women go into ketosis. So do we need to like push high levels of ketones in pregnancy? No. Do we need to push people to be ridiculously low carb for no reason? No. But we should be recommending a diet that helps them maintain, blood sugar balance, and the level of carbs that's going to be right for one woman to another. It does differ. I've seen that in practice many, many times. So yeah, that's my like very long answer, but it's a complicated question, and it's one that I don't think most people even haven't dug into the data to be able to answer. I think most people just default to ketones harmful and like end of conversation, and it really isn't that simple. There's a lot of nuance to it. Hello.
Hi. Welcome, Lily. We are so excited, like I said, to have you. Thank you so much for being on the show. If you could please tell our audience about yourself and your work, we'd love to get to know you.
Sure. My work tends to focus on nutrition for the childbearing years, during pregnancy, before pregnancy, postpartum, and also addressing pregnancy complications like gestational diabetes. I guess most people know me from my books. I have 3 of them now: Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, Real Food for Pregnancy, and now Real Food for Fertility. So a lot of my work is, focused on identifying areas where maybe our nutrition guidelines are not up to date, or maybe there's some new research questioning whether they have it right. And sort of filling in those gaps with the data. Having worked at least at a small level in the public policy area with the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, I know how challenging it is to change guidelines. And so I go at it from like the reverse angle, kind of the grassroots angle of educating women and couples and practitioners. And hopefully we'll eventually get some of those guidelines a little more up to date.
I know when I've had 5 pregnancies, and the first 4 pregnancies I went into the hospital system and I was just given a pamphlet of what to eat and what not to eat. But my 5th pregnancy, I hired a midwife, and it changed because she told me all about your book. And I had said, listen, I have a history of this. And she said, no problem. We're going to run the blood work ahead of time, keep an eye on it. And it was just a paradigm switch of, just the list of foods to avoid versus the list of foods that are going to nourish me and my baby. And so
Right.
I love your new book adds the piece of all of our cycles and how important all of our cycles are, and nourishing those as well. Can you tell us, like, one of my favorite things is the myths behind saturated fat?
Yeah. I mean, it's pervasive across the industry. I mean, I'm a originally conventionally trained dietitian, right? So my school was teaching all the same stuff that are in our nutrition guidelines. I mean, if you just go back to the history of how we got where we are, I mean, it all stems back from some cherry-picked data by Ansel Keys back in the 1960s, and a lot of industry influence to really push the hand of the first, dietary guidelines were really anti-saturated fat. They remain anti-saturated fat to this day. And they didn't address sugar back then or refined carbohydrates. So these guidelines were put into place based on shoddy data, and the food industry responds by people looking for low-fat items that are just now loaded full of sugar and refined carbohydrates. I think we can all remember, I don't know how old you are, but like Snackwells from the 80s and 90s, right? It's like, low fat everything, but full of refined carbs and sugars. So we've, pointed the finger at saturated fat, I believe, unfairly. If you look at some of the newer data we have, saturated fat coming from whole food sources like red meat or full fat dairy, is not associated with adverse cardiovascular risk factors. It's when the saturated fat is coming from ultra-processed foods, right? Alongside these refined carbohydrates and sugars, and not having the other micronutrients that you find in whole foods that naturally contain saturated fat. So it's really frustrating to me, because a lot of the data you see that says like, oh, saturated fat is bad for this reason, avoid red meat, avoid full fat dairy, avoid, eggs with the yolks or whatever. But a very small proportion of our saturated fat these days is even coming from things like red meat. I mean, most of it's coming from ultra-processed food. So this is just a challenge as a whole in the field of nutrition and nutrition science, is people like to cherry pick a single nutrient, call it good or bad, and then we make these sweeping recommendations based off of essentially incomplete information. So if you really work at keeping your saturated fat intake low, for the majority of people, the response is consuming more foods that have a million ingredients, because you take the fat out of sour cream, and I don't know if you've ever looked at a label for fat-free sour cream, but it's like a bunch of refined starches and gums and thickeners. It's not even real food, So the response is usually a lower nutrient density diet, usually a lower protein diet, because our protein foods often have fat with them. When it's animal source foods, especially, some of that is saturated fat, and you end up with a lower micronutrient intake, lower protein intake, a worse micronutrient or macronutrient rather balance. And to me, a lot of times that perpetuates this cycle of blood sugar spikes and crashes, hormonal imbalances, excessive cravings and hunger. It's not addressing the real elephant in the room, which is the ultra processed foods in the first place.
So my pregnancies were a while ago. You said you didn't know how old we are. I'm 48 and my youngest child is 15. And so in preparation for this interview, I was just kind of reminiscing, right, on my visits to my OBGYN. I mean, I think I vaguely remember some sort of food pyramid poster like on the wall.
Yep.
I don't think she mentioned nutrition once to me, other than take your prenatal vitamin and make sure you get the glucose tolerance test. I didn't even know why I was getting that. Like, because I wasn't in this space yet. I didn't even know. It was just like one of the things, right? Do all the blood work, and oh, by the way, drink this massive,
Right.
And I didn't know why I was getting that. Like, she didn't talk about gestational diabetes. I don't even know what she was checking during all that blood work she was doing. So it was just very like, the doctor was just in charge of it, and not forthcoming with the information on why we were doing the blood work and things that we were doing. But one of the things that interested me about what you talk about is seafood in pregnancy. And the reason is both of my children have ADHD. And they are helped when they take those omega-3, supplements. I can't get them to eat the seafood, and I don't like seafood, but I wish someone had told me more about that. Because it makes me wonder, right? So I would like for you to maybe address that, because I know there's maybe some misconceptions around that, but also the importance of it.
Yeah, for sure. So seafood is a bit of a controversial topic. I think there's some disagreement, although I feel like the disagreement usually stems from incomplete information or like incomplete understanding of the science. So fish becomes controversial primarily because it can be contaminated with mercury, and mercury is a neurotoxin, so people want to avoid that. But we have a lot of reassuring data on seafood and fish consumption in pregnancy related to that. There's actually the huge systematic review. I wrote about it on my blog. If you want to go to lilynicholsrdn.com and just put fish in the search bar, it'll pop right up. But we have data encompassing over 100,000 mother-offspring pairs, and they didn't find a level of seafood intake that was harmful to baby's brain development. Okay, even women eating upwards of 100 ounces of seafood per week, which I've never had a client who eats that much seafood, but even then there was no detriment to baby's brain development. They even accounted for mercury exposure and all of that. So why is it that seafood is so beneficial to neurodevelopment? It comes down to the micronutrient levels. So you pointed out the omega-3 fats like DHA. We have a huge amount of data supporting the importance of DHA for babies' brain development. Maternal stores will become depleted over the course of pregnancy if there isn't intake of DHA. Like, it actually depletes from the maternal brain. So it's kind of wild, because baby's going to take what baby needs, right? But what about when it's not even there, right? The average intake of DHA by most women of childbearing age, literally 95% of childbearing age, is not at the level that is even in our guidelines, which is a pretty conservative estimate of how much we require. So DHA is one piece of the puzzle that's definitely important. That would be covered if somebody didn't eat seafood, wants to take a fish oil supplement, or even an algae-based DHA supplement. If they don't do fish, like you could cover that. But there are other micronutrients in fish and seafood that are also beneficial. We have iodine. We know that benefits baby's brain development. You have the selenium, which prevents against mercury toxicity. You have vitamin B12. You have iron. You have zinc. There's so many other nutrients. I probably missed some off my top of my head, but there's so many other micronutrients in there where we have hard data on their role in neurodevelopment. I missed choline. That's another major one that's pretty concentrated in seafood. That it's a wise idea to consume some. Even by FDA guidelines, they recommend 12 ounces of seafood per week in pregnancy, prioritizing low mercury seafood. So, salmon, sardines, cod, those kinds of things would all be really, really wise choices. Although some of the newer data we have says maybe we don't need to be as concerned about mercury as we were in the past. So the occasional tuna and stuff like that is just fine as well.
I think that's incredible. And I really appreciate that you have so much knowledge. And I think that I wish that I had known about your books when I was pregnant. I found a lot of healing when I went from standard American diet to a whole food ketogenic diet a couple of years ago. I lost weight. My mental health improved. Constipation became normal. My irregular periods, they were very, very irregular. They became normal. And I was able to become pregnant. So I have a little bit of a wound to share, because when I was so excited with my first pregnancy, and I went to my OBGYN, and I told her I was on the ketogenic diet. She immediately told me I was going to harm my baby. She made me feel bad about it. And it was kind of like a threatening experience, like, you have to stop or you're going to harm your baby. And what hurt me the most is that I had finally found a way of eating that made me healthy. And then, now she's telling me that, I was going to harm her. So although I ended up having 2 healthy babies, I struggled with like depression and like some unresolved anger, and I was addicted to carbs and sugar again because I stopped doing keto. So my question is why do people say that ketosis is considered dangerous for pregnancy?
Yeah, this whole topic is the reason I wrote my first book on gestational diabetes, actually, because at the time it had been widely considered unsafe to lower carbohydrates in the maternal diet because you might go into ketosis. So this comes down to incomplete research, and I believe incorrect interpretation of the research at the time, because there's different types of ketosis, and some of them are not necessarily an issue, and other ones are extremely detrimental to fetal neural development. So the data that was primarily based on that made those recommendations, because the current recommendations are still the same as they stand. They say no less than 175 grams of carbohydrates per day in pregnancy. That stems from data on diabetic ketoacidosis or starvation ketosis. So diabetic ketoacidosis is an emergency medical situation. It happens in insulin dependent diabetics, usually type 1, so people who aren't producing like any insulin or very, 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 very little. And when you're in a low insulin state, your body cannot get energy out of your bloodstream, so to speak. So your blood glucose levels skyrocket. You start burning your own body fat stores for fuel. Your blood becomes very acidic. It's an emergency medical situation, often results in coma, but like blood sugar levels are sky high, ketone levels are also sky high, and your blood is sky high acidic. It is absolutely well documented to be a harmful emergency medical situation, and it absolutely harms fetal brain development. There's a lot going on there too, because just blood sugar levels being 300 plus also that's a teratogenic, like can cause birth defects level of blood sugar. So like that's also going on. We blame the ketones, but this is a complicated situation. That's not going to be experienced by somebody on a ketogenic diet in pregnancy. By the way, this is somebody with insulin-dependent diabetes who isn't taking their insulin or isn't taking it at a proper dose or time, or they're completely insulin deficient. Pregnancy is a high insulin state. So somebody who has gestational diabetes, or even diabetes that they don't have to control it with insulin, or somebody like yourself, you're not going to be in an insulin deficient state in pregnancy. DKA just doesn't happen outside of this very specific instance I just described. The starvation ketosis, it will happen when somebody is not eating. So they're completely starved. That means you're not getting enough calories, enough protein, enough micronutrients, enough of anything. Your ketone levels are also super high. Not as high as DKA, but definitely higher than what we'd see in like nutritional ketosis. And you're starving. So you're burning your own body fat stores and breaking down your own tissue for fuel. That's obviously harmful in pregnancy, because being deficient even in a single micronutrient like B12 or iodine or choline can lead to brain development issues. And so again, starvation obviously is a mismatch for optimal fetal development. So what you're describing is nutritional ketosis, somebody who's on a ketogenic diet. The body actually very carefully controls blood ketone levels in pregnancy. So in somebody who is taking in a ketogenic diet but is eating sufficient calories, sufficient protein, sufficient micronutrients, you may be spilling ketones in your urine, which blood ketones and urine ketones really don't correlate quite well in pregnancy. They can't be used as a diagnostic, even though some clinicians unfortunately still do. But your blood ketone levels stay in a pretty narrow range, assuming you're eating enough fuel. You're not like going into your body fat stores for fuel. And there has not been documented harms to fetal neurodevelopment from that. In fact, the placenta creates ketones, like it undergoes ketogenesis and sends ketones to the baby. About 30% of brain energy needs for that fetus is supplied by ketones. And then babies are born in ketosis. They're actually in the deepest state of ketosis in the first couple days of life, as mother's milk is transitioning from colostrum to mature milk. They actually need to be adapted to ketogenesis to properly like transition through that stage. Otherwise, you're going to have situations of low blood sugar that can occur. So sometimes we have poorly controlled diabetes in pregnancy, that baby has not been able to be keto adapted. Their insulin levels are super high. You cut off the sugar supply when the cord is cut, but their insulin levels are high and their blood sugar tanks, and they have trouble mobilizing their body fat stores for fuel. This becomes like a medical emergency, actually. So it's never made sense to me that we can think that nutritional ketosis is going to be problematic in pregnancy because it's going to harm fetal brain development if babies literally are adapted to go in and out of ketosis at will. So it just doesn't make sense. It also doesn't make sense from an ancestral perspective, because we do have communities like in the far north, like Arctic, who by default had to traditionally subsist on a ketogenic diet. and they seem to be able to reproduce, and their babies are not all neurodevelopmentally compromised. So like, it doesn't make sense from an ancestral perspective. The bigger issue here is like, whatever dietary choice somebody is making, whether keto or not, and I don't necessarily push a ketogenic diet in pregnancy. Like, I'm not trying to get people's, ketone levels elevated on purpose. I think we should be eating the least restrictive diet possible while still maintaining healthy blood sugar levels. That's really where I stand. But to point the finger at ketosis overtly being harmful, like mild nutritional ketosis, just simply doesn't make sense. Like, your body is actually primed to go into ketosis in late pregnancy. You're like, when you're pregnant, you're like threefold more likely to be in ketosis after an overnight fast than when you're not pregnant. Your body just like very rapidly switches from fat burning to carb burning at will. Even between meals, sometimes women go into ketosis. So do we need to like push high levels of ketones in pregnancy? No. Do we need to push people to be ridiculously low carb for no reason? No. But we should be recommending a diet that helps them maintain, blood sugar balance, and the level of carbs that's going to be right for one woman to another. It does differ. I've seen that in practice many, many times. So yeah, that's a very long answer, but it's a complicated question, and it's one that I don't think most people even haven't dug into the data to be able to answer. I think most people just default to ketones harmful and like end of conversation, and it really isn't that simple. There's a lot of nuance to it.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful. That helped me heal a little bit. I really appreciate that.
This is so interesting because my first child, my milk didn't come in. I've had milk issues with all my babies, but they just kept saying, keep nursing, keep nursing, keep nursing. And eventually my baby became unresponsive, and we had to one. And so this just makes so much sense and I was incredibly overweight during that pregnancy. And even though I passed my glucose test, maybe I falsely passed it. Maybe there was blood sugar issues the whole time. And then we cut the supply off, and now this baby's blood sugar has dived, right? I also have heard you say something about mitochondrial health and the first 1,000 days. And something really interesting is my first two babies, I was very overweight when I had them. And now those two kids both very much struggle.
The milk supply challenges, it could have to do with baby's metabolism not being like keto adapted or whatever, where they're struggling fat adapted. But maternal insulin resistance can make it challenging for milk supply to come back on board. So there's greater nursing challenges sometimes in women with like a history of gestational diabetes, or it can be undiagnosed, but you have really high insulin levels, but you're able to overcome and maintain somewhat normal blood sugar levels. So that can certainly be an issue. And then is your sound back?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Yeah, keep going.
Okay.
I was just answering the milk supply part.
I don't know if it cut off, but like my first two pregnancies, I was heavier. My kids struggle with weight. My second two pregnancies, I was at a healthier weight, healthier blood sugar regulation, and they seem to be able to eat anything on earth. And I heard you say something about that first 1,000 days, and that our health, as even before we get pregnant, can affect their mitochondrial health and their setup for life.
Yes. So you do inherit your mitochondria from your mom. So after the egg is fertilized, paternal mitochondria are destroyed. And so what the baby inherits is mom's mitochondrial health, or your mitochondrial function at the time. On top of that, depending on what's going on in the pregnancy, blood sugar and insulin levels, that also continues to affect the baby during their development. So it can affect the development of the pancreas, for example, where they have a larger pancreas. It produces more insulin. The babies are slightly insulin resistant at birth. So we know, risk of type 2 diabetes, for example, in children born to mom where blood sugar was not optimal. It can be in anywhere from like 6 to 19-fold higher risk that they develop type 2 diabetes later in their life. And I don't want to throw out all the fear-mongering stats here, because that doesn't mean it's fate or destiny that those kids will end up developing that, but they may have to work a little harder. They probably are programmed almost to be a little more insulin resistant. They may have to put in a little more effort on controlling carbohydrates, optimizing protein intake, staying active, maybe even considering like some other practices or supplementation and stuff to really optimize and rev up their metabolic function. But there's like, yeah, a little bit more of an uphill battle. So when we look population wide, because I really am not intending to single you out by any means or your children, population wide, when we look at like the rise in diabetes as a population and the rise in obesity, and how that's like really risen very quickly in children, especially, you look back at when that started, and it's like our first dietary guidelines came out in the 1980s. So you have all these women who have gone through pregnancy eating, you know, high carbs, spiking their blood sugar and insulin levels. And then we have that generation. Now that generation is having kids, and even that generation may in some cases already be having kids. And it seems like the metabolic issues are almost multiplying exponentially. As you know, you've been able to like reverse your metabolic health with good nutrition, but it's like the same sorts of things that you have done to improve your metabolic health. Your first two kids may have to implement more of that, may have to be a little more on top of that to optimize that for themselves, which is probably, you know, tricky depending on the age, and, you know, teens just want to eat whatever they want to eat. But seeing your example, I'm sure will help.
Interesting too, just the different blood sugar approaches. When I was having them, and then even my third pregnancy, I started having reactive hypoglycemia, and I was told to just kind of keep eating carbs all the time so that it wouldn't drop. Then I lost a baby at 20 weeks, and during that time, the genetic testing was fine, but I was having a lot of stress from life, and my blood sugar kept dropping, and nobody could give me answers on if that was bad for my baby, how we could regulate it. Now we moved to my midwife, my final pregnancy, and she tells me, I tell her I have this horrible hypoglycemia. She says, no problem, eat protein and fat. So I love this approach and she got that from your book. I love this approach of let's nourish you versus let's let it. Like in my other pregnancies, I also had preeclampsia, which we didn't find out until it blew up, where I told her I had through preeclampsia. She said, no problem. We'll run blood work at a time. We'll keep an eye on it. And something I've heard from you is, Adrian, you need more salt. So I added salt. Can you tell people about why that's important? And because people are mind blown when they saw me with my history of preeclampsia drinking salt water.
Yeah. Yeah, I personally have struggled with reactive hypoglycemia as well. And of course, everybody, tries the treating with carbs, right? Yeah, you raise your blood sugar back up for a little while, and then guess what? You crash again, right? So optimizing protein and fat intake has been a total game changer for me as well. So it's silly. I don't know, it's almost like a Band-Aid solution. Like, we'll just eat more carbs and it'll go back up. It's like you're perpetuating the cycle over and over and over again. So I feel you on that. As for the preeclampsia and the salt conversation, and by the way, I wonder with your reactive hypoglycemia, if like your blood sugar had been fairly stable, but your insulin levels were still high. You know, it takes a while for insulin levels to like kind of come down and regulate. And so I wonder if that might have been going on. But yeah, as far as like salt and electrolytes, you know, you have 50% increase in fluid volume during pregnancy. You'll have a lot more fluids on board. And with those bodily fluids, you need electrolytes to go with them. That includes sodium. It has others, you know, calcium, magnesium, potassium, chloride, which would be in your sodium chloride, your table salt. But you need more of those electrolytes. So it's very silly that we would be telling pregnant women to consume less salt. I mean, oftentimes a lot of pregnancy cravings are for salty foods. Like, that's for good reason. Your body is trying to maintain your fluid balance and electrolyte status. very, that's very intelligent design right there. So the preeclampsia conversation, what's really, really interesting if you dive into some of the older data on this, like going back to the mid 1900s, because they had identified and written about in some research papers how you could treat preeclampsia, they called it toxemia back then, with salt supplementation. They would have women measure out 4 teaspoons of salt per day and consume it over the course of the day, every day, and the toxemia symptoms would resolve miraculously. Nowadays, that's been like abandoned in place of restricting sodium intake, because we still have this very outdated perspective that salt is the cause of high blood pressure, and it really isn't. And actually, the majority of the people who even do have a blood sugar response to blood pressure response to eating more sodium, it's because they need more potassium to go with it, and they need to manage their blood sugar levels better. Your blood sugar and your blood pressure levels, they go hand in hand. So you can drive what they call salt sensitive hypertension with excess fructose intake, like such as high fructose corn syrup. You can actually drive that situation. But once you've gotten your, chosen healthier carbs and aren't doing as much of the refined stuff, you're getting enough potassium from your diet, you can actually increase salt with no increase in blood pressure. And some people notice a decrease in their blood pressure when they increase the sodium. So it's opposite of what we've been told. That's all I could say. So I recommend people salt their food to taste. I like using sea salt because you have some of the other trace minerals in there as well. I think it's also really important to optimize your potassium and magnesium intake as well. Don't just increase the salt without thinking about the others. So there's, many potassium is spread widely throughout the food supply. For those who feel better staying low carb, there are low carb potassium sources as well. Like avocado is really excellent source of potassium. It's not all just bananas and orange juice. And oftentimes that does dramatically improve preeclampsia, improve blood pressure, improve, ironically, swelling, because that's another one. People are told you're going to swell if you consume more salt. That's not always the case, particularly if it's consumed in balance with your potassium and magnesium. So yeah, electrolytes, huge, huge conversation. I have another blog article on my site on electrolytes and pregnancy that people can check out if you want to see, food sources for all those various electrolytes or options for potentially like an electrolyte replacement. But it makes a massive, massive, massive difference. That plus getting your blood sugar in a good range. I have so many stories of women who have been able to avoid preeclampsia or potentially delay its onset and severity in subsequent pregnancies. Because it's not all diet lifestyle. We don't know why preeclampsia arises, but there are situations when it has its origins all the way back to early pregnancy, or even paternal health. Quality of male sperm can affect preeclampsia risk because that affects the development of the placenta. So some of this goes way, way, way back. That said, a lot of these interventions during pregnancy can lessen the risk or severity.
And sorry, I don't mean to take up all the time, guys, but one thing that you talk about that's really important, which we're seeing is important, is testing for that blood sugar. And I know me with my hyporeactive hypoglycemia, I didn't want to take that because I knew this is going to make me sick, but they didn't offer me anything else. Like, what else could someone do? Because this is an important test that it does help with the health of your baby and to have a healthy pregnancy. What else could people do?
Yeah, well, I think they should be offering other alternatives, and I've written about this at length. There's a whole section in Real Food for Pregnancy book on gestational diabetes screening options. So if you're already at that 24 to 28 week mark, I would say you can consider a couple things. My preference for those who don't want to do a glucose tolerance test, and I get why people don't want to. I opted out my second pregnancy as well. Home blood sugar monitoring really is going to be probably your best option. So you get a blood sugar meter. You could also do a CGM, like continuous glucose monitor, and you monitor your blood sugar for about 2 weeks, and you compare your readings to what is expected in a typical healthy pregnancy and also the gestational diabetes targets. And I have a little chart for both of those in the book. And the nice thing about that is that you get data that you can actually use. Like you can see if something spikes your blood sugar and be like, oh, wow, normally my blood sugar is fine. And I had this meal with a large serving of rice and holy cow, my blood sugar spiked a lot. You can actually like actively use what you've learned to maintain better blood sugar for the rest of the pregnancy. I think the reason that some providers don't like that method is that it doesn't give them a clear diagnostic cutoff. Like it's much easier in conventional healthcare to just be like, take this test. This is when you pass. This is when you failed. And some women don't want to do the testing their blood sugar for 2 weeks. I mean, it's a lot. If you're doing a finger prick, you have to check your blood sugar first thing in the morning for fasting. You have to check after every single meal. Like it is work. You may have to pay out of pocket for the meter and the strips. And so I get why some people just want to do, the glucose tolerance test as well. The other more viable option for testing, which can happen and would only apply earlier in pregnancy, is you can screen with a hemoglobin A1C in the first trimester. And this will give you a proxy of whether or not you're like in the pre-diabetic range, or even sometimes we find overt type 2 diabetes at that stage that was undiagnosed. But anything in the pre-diabetic range, 5.7% or higher, is technically considered a positive diagnosis for gestational diabetes. You don't need to do any more screening later in the pregnancy. Really what we're identifying was pre-pregnancy insulin resistance. The chances that you would then go on to fail a glucose tolerance test is over 98%. So you may as well identify it early, start checking your blood sugar then, implementing dietary lifestyle changes that keep your blood sugar in range. Then you have like 2/3 of your pregnancy to be proactively working on this and making sure you're, providing an optimal environment for your baby's development versus waiting until 24 to 28 weeks to do the glucola or another test. Not all providers are on board with doing an A1C. Back when I worked in California in a fairly forward-thinking perinatology practice, we used A1C on every single client. And we actually very rarely had to do glucose tolerance tests because most of them we were catching in that first trimester. And if they tested high, we were implementing, they met with me, they got nutrition advice, dietary lifestyle advice, they got a blood sugar meter, and they were monitoring their blood sugar for the course of that whole pregnancy. And we could just very much reduce the risks that gestational diabetes is going to have an adverse effect if we catch it and treat it early. So that's another viable option, but that only applies in the first trimester because A1C becomes inaccurate in later pregnancy. It artificially lowers. So you can't use the same thresholds later on for diagnosis. In fact, it would actually be a concern if your A1C does not go down in later pregnancy. It should be going down if your blood sugar.
Okay. Wow. What an answer. I know at work, there's several pregnant women or recently pregnant women. And there's gestational diabetes that is going along with that. And so I hope that this, information gets out there for people, that there are other options and how to keep that under control. I'm hoping you can provide us some practical tips for managing pregnancy cravings, while still having a balanced diet, and maybe why do some of us get meat aversion? Oh, I did, like raw chicken. If I saw it, I was like, nope, I can't eat chicken.
Yeah.
Can you speak to some of that? Because I just went by, if I wanted it, I ate it.
Right. I mean, yeah, there's all sorts of theories on the cravings and aversions, ranging from, maybe your body is seeking certain nutrients and that's why you're craving it, or maybe your body is trying to protect you from potential toxins that could harm baby, or it's a food that's very likely to be spoiled. Like you think about ancestrally, raw meat that's going to be one of the quickest things to spoil and become contaminated with harmful bacteria that could make you sick, that could result in, fetal loss or something tragically. And so maybe there's some carryover from that. We don't really know for sure. It's very interesting because the cravings and aversions I've seen different for different clients. So this is all anecdotal, but I've heard from people who are formerly vegan or even still trying to be vegan during their pregnancy, they crave burgers. Or I had one lady who craved oysters, bone broth, and egg yolks. Of all things, like that fills in really almost every micronutrient gap that may exist on a vegan diet right there with those foods. Pretty odd. I've had others who crave liver and organ meats. Like maybe they really need the iron or the choline or the B12 or the vitamin A. I don't know. And then on the flip side, from clients who've been previously keto or carnivore, paleo, I feel like the protein meat aversions are a lot stronger. Perhaps you already have enough of those nutrient stores. Perhaps maybe your body actually wants a little more carbs in pregnancy, especially the first trimester when you're dealing with nausea. The nausea and food aversions often co-occur at the same time. This is a time when your thyroid is like rapidly ramping up its production of thyroid hormones. And, maybe we need a little more carbs during that time. Maybe it has to do with just carbs settle our stomach a little easier. They digest sooner. So they aren't kind of like sitting as heavy in your stomach, perhaps as like a really, fat heavy meal. We don't really know why, but I would say just try to roll with it as best that you can, still trying to get in some protein. So if you're averse to meat, especially in the nausea phase, maybe dairy protein is a little better tolerated. I often hear cheese, cottage cheese, Greek yogurt, like those are fine. Beans and legumes can be a little easier. They don't have as much of smell. Having somebody prepare the food for you can just take away the ick factor of having to handle the raw meat or having to smell it when it just starts cooking. So I've had people who have a, crock pot cooking in their garage. They can eat it when it's all cooked, but they don't like smelling it while it's cooking, or have their husband grill outside, or pre-prepared items from the grocery store. Whatever it is, that can all be a helpful option, or even, smoothies with protein powder or something could be okay as well. Nuts and seeds, get creative, right? I will also say that the cravings sometimes have nothing to do with pregnancy itself. And it's simply that we may be craving something that is nostalgic to us. Like maybe our mom made mac and cheese for us when we were a kid, and so that sounds good and warm and fuzzy inside. Or maybe the item we're craving, if it's a really specific thing, like Flamin' Hot Cheetos or something bizarre, that may just be that those ultra-processed foods have been engineered by the food companies to be highly addictive. I mean, they want you to keep buying their product, and they put in a ton of R&D into the perfect ratios of fat and sugar and salt and the flavor chemicals and the color and the crunch factor, and all that stuff plays in. It may have nothing to do with pregnancy, but sometimes people feel more like, I'm allowed to give into the cravings because I'm pregnant. So whatever, I'm eating for two, it's fine. So, lean into that with some curiosity and see if the craving really is coming from a true place. Maybe I need more sodium and maybe this is why I'm craving this. Or if it's just, that's a highly addictive processed food. This is why I'm craving it, not necessarily the pregnancy.
Before we go into the questions from our people, can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I know I have given every scary scenario that you can have, but the good news here with your books and with the information that I got from you and from my midwife is many of those issues were fixable with real food. And so my first pregnancies, I thought I was eating healthy. I think I was eating processed, healthy, marketed foods. Then my third pregnancy, I was eating more vegetables and a little bit of meat because I was trying to get all those nutrients in. And then the fourth, the final baby, she said, I want you to have more meat and more eggs. And I couldn't. So it was such a switch. Now, there are nutrients in all of our real foods, but what is the difference between the absorbability and all of that between plant proteins and iron and nutrients and animal?
Yep. I mean, I'm a proponent of an omnivorous diet, so I'll throw that out there first and foremost. But I do write a lot about the necessity of animal-sourced foods for certain nutrients. This goes beyond the micronutrients of concern, like vitamin B12, for example, and into also the protein quality and the amino acid balance, and even the types of amino acids that are available from different foods. So protein quality is simply less in plant proteins than it is animal proteins. They don't have the full component of all the amino acids, including some of these ones that are so-called non-essential, although there's amino acid researchers now who are saying that was never even a scientifically proven concept. I have a blog article on protein and pregnancy where I go into this more if anybody wants to read up on the research on this. So my opinion is that we need a balance of both, but especially prioritizing the animal protein to get all of the both essential and non-essential, so-called non-essential amino acids to optimize your health and your baby's health in pregnancy, but also to hit all of our micronutrient needs. So, outside of B12 and like DHA, technically you can get a lot of nutrients from plant foods, but they may not be as absorbable. You gave iron as an example, or they may not be in high enough concentrations that they meet our needs. So choline is a good example. It's a B vitamin-like compound that's really important for baby's brain development, for placental health, for liver health. And that is a really tricky one to get on a fully plant-based diet because the concentration of choline in plant foods is so much less than it is in animal foods. So especially if the diet lacks eggs, for example, because egg yolks are really our number one source of choline. Like more than half of the choline an average person consumes is from egg yolks specifically. So you do have to be careful. The iron conversation, I actually recently put out a blog post on iron absorption from different food sources, and I have some graphics in that article showing the relative absorption of iron from plant foods versus animal foods. So the iron found in animal foods is called heme iron. It's absorbed at like 25 to 40% efficiency, whereas the iron in plant foods is in a form called non-heme. And it's absorbed anywhere from like 1 to maybe 12%, but usually like less than 5% for a typical plant food. So if you're just comparing like, okay, this spinach has this amount of iron and this piece of steak has this amount of iron, but you're not factoring in the percent of absorption, you're going to underestimate how much spinach you actually need to get the same amount of iron from a much smaller portion of steak or liver or oysters or clams or anything like that. So I would definitely have people check out the iron blog on my site. Again, go to my website, type in iron, has all these graphics where we've spelled out and done all the math comparing the two, not just the quantity to match the amount in the food, but the quantity to match the absorption from what's in that food.
We do have some questions from Nia. She says, thoughts on carnivore during pregnancy? Would one need to supplement in any way to get increased levels of nutrients like folate?
Yeah, I mean, there are some nutrients of concern on carnivore, depending on what the diet is made up of. So technically, and you can go to my article on folate on my site. I have a lot of articles on my website in addition to all the stuff that's in my book.
I've been linking
this
them.
Information to be like as freely available as possible. In that article, I do note that there are some foods that are quite rich in folate that aren't the ones we typically think of. So like liver, for example, is really rich in folate. However, like the quantity of liver you would have to consume to meet your folate needs alone is probably too much liver. I have an article on liver on my website too, if you want to dive into that in that controversial land as well. So folate would be one to think about for sure. I mean, I would just think about like, what is your rationale for staying carnivore? Are you open to adding in some plant foods? Because you will get a broader micronutrient balance. Folate is one to consider. Potassium is one to consider. Magnesium is one to consider. Some of these, of course, or I guess you could say all of them, could be made up for by taking a comprehensive prenatal vitamin, which I recommend to everybody. But I would just go by how you feel. And like, we may have an idea of how we want to eat during our pregnancy, and then things change and we feel different. We actually want this, or we want more of that. And so if you find yourself at a point in pregnancy where suddenly the foods you liked are averse, or you're not feeling well, or your digestion is not quite right, or you're craving something like citrus, like, I would be in full support of giving into that and loosening up the reins on like what your concept of what is like optimal or healthy or the best diet for you. I've just worked with so many women who come in with like a very clear idea of like, oh, I'm going to eat this way and I'm going to stick to this. And then it just doesn't work out that way. So be open to your symptoms guiding you in a different direction. At the same time, I've heard from people who have done well on a carnivore diet in pregnancy. I will say another thing to keep in mind, I would recommend having some seafood in there as well. If you're not already, just to get in some of those more challenging nutrients like iodine and DHA. Hopefully you're also doing eggs with the yolks. So if you are sticking to all animal foods, make it as broad of a variety as possible, because the micronutrient makeup and the amino acid makeup of different animal foods even varies. So as much variety as possible, least restriction possible to feel your best is my preference.
Okay, thank you so much. Nia has one more question for you. She says, how important is diet before becoming pregnant compared to during pregnancy?
Well, I just wrote a whole book on that. So, they're both important. The challenge of talking about this is inevitably you have people who are going to be concerned on either side. Like, oh my gosh, I'm already pregnant and I didn't think about doing this before pregnancy and I've ruined it, and the sky is falling. And then, yeah. So I don't want anybody to worry that you're too late to make nutrition changes. I have people, reaching out to me at like 30 weeks. Am I too late to change my diet? In fact, I even wrote an article about that on my site too. But in an ideal world, in an optimal scenario, having good nutrition, good metabolic health, good sleep habits, healthy hormone balance, a healthy menstrual cycle leading into pregnancy. And on top of that, your partner having healthy lifestyle factors, so his sperm development is also optimal. I'd say a minimum of about 3 to 6 months pre-conception. We're talking about optimal here. I know like 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. And again, I don't want anybody to be feeling poorly about themselves because they didn't put in effort, ahead of time. But if we come into pregnancy healthy, we'll have healthier egg and sperm, a greater chance that fertilization is going to go right, a greater chance that implantation is going to be working properly, a greater chance that the endometrial lining where that embryo implants is going to be robust enough to support the growth of that embryo, going to be robust enough to support the development of the placenta. The way the placenta attaches to the uterine wall really ultimately affects the risk of pregnancy complications later in pregnancy. The placenta expresses more paternal DNA than it does maternal DNA, interestingly. Isn't that crazy? Because it's made from embryonic tissue. So dad's health actually really does affect the health of the placenta, and potentially the health of pregnancy and risk for certain complications like preeclampsia. So in an ideal world, we are thinking about things ahead of time. Most of our major birth defects, especially our structural defects, were like, a congenital heart defect or a missing, finger or an organ that isn't formed properly, or congenital diaphragmatic hernia where like your diaphragm, the baby's diaphragm doesn't form properly. And then you have digestive organs like developing in the chest cavity where the lungs should be. Those all have their origins in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. And there is actually quite a bit of research. I didn't even mention neural tube defects, the major one that everybody always mentions, but those all happen in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. And those are affected by maternal nutrient intake and nutrient stores. And so if you're entering into pregnancy deficient, there's just a greater chance that there's going to be challenges. I mean, nature is always trying to find a way. Your body is always going to try to make everything go off, perfectly. And there's plenty of these complications that have absolutely nothing to do with how healthy you were ahead of time, and they just are complete chance. Like sometimes things go wrong. You see it in nature. Sometimes there's leaves that are malformed on a plant, and like, I wonder why that went wrong. Not everything goes perfectly all the time, even if you're optimally nourished and doing all the things. But we do have hard data showing a reduction in the risk of these things. So I would say, yeah, it matters equally, potentially, if not more, if we think about how so many things in early pregnancy are affecting things later in pregnancy, to get your nutrition in a good place ahead of time. Again, if you have the luxury of planning a pregnancy, because we know not all pregnancies are planned. So Real Food for Fertility, I mean, it's a giant book, as you can see. That would be the book to get if you want to work on optimizing. And we do have a chapter on sperm quality in there as well. My other books have all focused on, women's health. This one does have the male component built in, and I would definitely give that a read ahead of time, really to optimize everything.
Yeah, instead of what to expect when you're expecting, we should start handing your book out, and the work that you're doing to spread this different message that we can heal and we can have healthier pregnancies and we can overcome some of these things. It's amazing. Do you think that you'll ever make a book on menopause?
That's so funny. I was just asked that yesterday. I don't know. Maybe when I get to that stage, I will feel more open to it. My books are a huge undertaking because there's just so much research that goes into them, and they just keep getting bigger. Like every next book I write is bigger than the last. So like this latest book has over 2,300 in-text citations. I mean, it was a 3-year undertaking, even with my co-author, Lisa Hendrickson Jack, helping. It's just a lot. It's a lot of work. So currently, since this one is like brand new and I'm just like finally getting my footing under me to work on other projects, I'm like, I don't ever want to write a book again. But that may change. I may change my mind. So give me some time. Give me another like 10 years. Maybe I'll change my
dang
mind.
it, I'm already 48, Lily. I don't know if I can wait that long.
I know. And I all the time I'm hearing from people who are like, I wish your book was out when I was at, this stage or whatever. I'm like, hey, I wish Real Food for Pregnancy was out before I had my first baby. I started writing that when my son was 10 months old, a lot because of the frustration you expressed, Adrian, of just feeling like, oh my gosh, there was like no information given about preventative care. And I had to do all this research on my own. I know the average woman is not doing that. I gotta put it into a book, I guess. Right. But it's never too late to be working on improving your diet and switching things up. And I will say, from everything that I know, just, from what I've read thus far, although there's not a book on it yet, the same kind of information that applies in Real Food for Fertility is optimizing your your chances of having a smooth sailing during menopause. Like if we're supporting hormonal balance and menstrual cycle health in our 30s and 40s, we're going to have a much easier time once we hit menopause. So I would suspect, if I were to go all the way down, like researching this and writing about this, I would suspect a lot of the same principles apply. Optimizing protein, watching your carb quality and quantity, better quality fats, sleep, movement, waking up at a decent hour and getting some light exposure, and then maybe some supplemental support for optimizing our mitochondrial health. But a lot of that overlaps with the things you do to support egg quality and menstrual cycle health, right? Just probably becomes a little more important once those ovarian, hormones are not there. You're now relying much more readily on your adrenals to handle it. So how well have you been managing stress in your 30s and 40s? That's going to come into play and become more apparent once menopause hits.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for being on the show. I do want to share your books with everyone and your website, and so that they can have more resources from you. Obviously, we want to support your work that you've been painstakingly working on. So as we know, Lily her expertise lies in evidence-based prenatal nutrition and exercise. She's renowned for meticulous research, as we've seen today, and we're so thankful for. Please support her works. Here's all of the books. They're so beautiful. I love all these and more. And you can find them on Amazon and also on her website, which I'd like to share with everyone. We were giving links to all the wonderful articles that you had mentioned, but you can always go to Lily Nichols RDN.com, and you can find all that information that she was sharing with us today. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart and all the lionesses here, thank you so much for joining us on the Lioness Lifestyle Live. We were really looking forward to meeting you and learning so much wisdom for you. So please, everyone, go support Lily and her books, because she's helping so many pregnant women create the healthiest babies that they can. I think this would be a great baby shower gift. If I got this as a baby shower gift, I think I would be pretty happy. So thanks so much for that.
Yeah. And the last chapter of Real Food for Pregnancy is all about postpartum. We didn't talk about postpartum recovery here, but that's another big passion of mine as well, is optimizing the recovery and just like your experience of early motherhood. So that's also included, because postpartum nutrition recovery was not also part of my experience in my first pregnancy. And I think that's an area that's, underappreciated. So thank you so much for having me on.
I'm sure we would love to have you back and talk about that, because that is something I never heard of, the whole postpartum. Yeah, see, Nia's saying part 2 for postpartum. I certainly never thought about that. It was just like surviving the lack of sleep, but I never thought about my nutrition.
Exactly.
Postpartum.
Yeah.
So. All right. Well,
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
We'll catch you guys next Tuesday. We'll have another awesome guest for you.